Dr. Raymond Moody.
Again, thank you all very much. And tonight I'm going to talk with you, as I said last night, about reincarnation. And I want to say from the very beginning here that I am not the expert in this room on reincarnation. Swami Swarupananda, for example, has spent his whole life studying this, and other Swamis, whereas this to me has been not the main focus of my research, but rather near-death experiences. So I will enter into some speculation and thought about reincarnation, but with the proviso that you will understand that there are people here who know a lot more about this than I do. Well, the way I initially encountered the idea of reincarnation, again, is in connection with ancient Greek philosophy. And one thing that I find very interesting is that in the United States, at least, there's this popular myth or idea that the idea of reincarnation was introduced into the West from the East fairly recently, or just like in the 19th century. But this is not true. And oddly, the idea of reincarnation was present with the Greek philosophers from the very beginning. In that, Pythagoras was the person who coined the term philosophy, and the sort of central point, say, pivot point of Pythagoras' life to dating for you was, say, around 550 BCE. And we know that Pythagoras claimed to remember 8 of his past lives. And not only that, is that I'm sort of constantly reading and rereading the ancient Greek philosophers, and in my latest study of Pythagoras, I came across the information either that I'd never realized or had just forgotten, that not only did Pythagoras remember his past lives, but he also had some sort of technique where he could get other people to remember their past lives as well. Whether this was some sort of hypnotic technique, as with the past life regression technique in the contemporary world, we don't know. But apparently, he had a very active understanding of reincarnation from this early period. Another very colorful figure in early Greek philosophy who was mentioned the reincarnation ideas was Empedocles. And Empedocles was a very colorful pre-Socratic philosopher who is the person who formulated the notion of elements. I suppose we've all studied chemistry to some degree, and you know that the notion of an element is the notion of a substance that can't be converted to some other substance or reduced to some other substance. And it was Empedocles who first propounded this notion that the elements are not interchangeable. And before Empedocles' time, this was thought to be true. For example, the early Greek philosopher Thales, for example, thought that everything was ultimately water, but that the other elements, earth, air, and fire, were all just somehow transformations of this basic underlying element of water. But Empedocles said, no, it's not true, that the elements are not interconvertible. But in his writing as well, Empedocles talks clearly about his past life memories and his stories about what he was in previous incarnations. A nice and very interesting little sidelight on Empedocles is that in the generation or so before Empedocles, there was a Greek philosopher named Xenophanes, who in his studies had traveled high into the mountains, and he observed that high in the mountains there were these fossilized organisms that obviously came at some point from the sea bottom and had been thrust up. And he realized that these very primitive creatures were fossilized on mountaintops. So that knowledge was already in the background by the time of Empedocles. But Empedocles went on to yet a further thought. He realized that the early organisms, apparently, were very primitive, but if you look around us now, we see very complex sort of organisms. So Empedocles surmised that there had to be intermediate forms that, since they weren't put together right, just didn't make it. So in his Origin of Species, and the footnote on very near the front of the book, Darwin gives credit to Empedocles for coming up with the first evolutionary theory. And then the person in the Greek tradition who propounded and articulated the notion of reincarnation most brilliantly, again, was Plato, who in his Republic and also his Phaedo, and as I recall also his dialogue, the Gorgias, talks about reincarnation, of which he was apparently convinced. Plato made some very interesting observations about the reincarnation process, that things that just come up naturally, I think, in our curiosity about it. One is, if we had past lives, why don't we remember it now? And Plato said that just before you come back into this state of existence from the other side, as he put it, you drink of the waters of forgetfulness and forget all you know. So you come into the world having forgotten your previous existences. No doubt that makes your learning experience here a bit more focused. And but Plato also said that sometimes people don't drink quite so much of the waters of forgetfulness, so they come back and they have a little more memories of their past lives than most of us. One thing that I find so interesting about this little detail is that it reminds me of a very fascinating psychological notion called that of the event boundary. And it turns out that the mind organizes things for processing in little packets, as it were, like thoughts and perceptions and ideas will be put together in a packet. And that the mind sort of works within these structures or strictures. And the most common experience that I assume everybody here has had that illustrates the operation of an event boundary is when you're in one room and you think of something you want to get in another room. You find that as soon as you walk through the door into the other room, what do? You forget. Right? You forget what you came into the room for. So very often you have to backtrack and go on. Then you can remember why you came in there. And that's what an event boundary is. And I gather that the Platonic notion of this waters of forgetfulness, you see, is equivalent in effect to an event boundary. So we can say that there is an event boundary between this existence that we're in now and the one that, let's say, we came from before. I wonder if this could have anything to do with why some people don't remember near-death experiences after a close call with death. I really mean that's just rank speculation. I don't know. I suppose it's conceivable. There are three kinds of human experiences at least three kinds, that relate to the possibility of reincarnation. And the first one I want to start with, because it's the area that I have studied most about, are reincarnation memories within the context of a near-death experience. And I have heard a number of these over the years. They are quite rare. And as I gather, they have nothing to do with whether the person had some prior religious background which inclined them to the area of idea of reincarnation. The first two I heard, actually, was when I was in medical school, and I was in medical school in Georgia. And it turned out both of these individuals who had past life memories in connection with their near-death experiences had been Southern Baptists, of all things, which is a doctrine I gather that has nothing to do with the idea of reincarnation. But I suppose one of the most dramatic ones like this I've ever heard came from a wonderful woman named Vi Horton in Augusta, Georgia, who in May of 1971 had just an astonishing near-death experience. She was under an apparent cardiac arrest for 40 minutes and had just amazing things happen to her. But even though she had no grounding whatsoever in ideas about reincarnation, in her life review, she had an aspect of her life review convinced her that there was reincarnation. And again, I should preface this by saying, as people with these experiences often do, see, it's very difficult to put it into words because there are no words really to express these things. Nonetheless, she was a very articulate person, and this is how she explained it. She said, as she looked at this entire panorama of her life, she said from certain incidents in this present life that she was in, that there were what she called filaments. She said it's like little filaments of light would go back and connect with events that she could see that apparently had taken place in earlier lives. And the one example that she related that I think is most typical of them and was really quite startling. By the way, I knew Vi's family very well. I met her in connection with her near-death experience, and I got to know everybody in her family except for her mother, who had already died. But I met her two older sisters and her father and her daughter and her husband. I knew them all well, so I had not only her story, but also the accounts of the relatives of her who could attest to the amazing transformation of character that she underwent when she had her near-death experience. But Vi was the youngest of the three children and had two older sisters. And she told me, and her sisters and father also told me, that when Vi was 3 years old, she ran out in front of across the street in front of her house, and a car was coming along, and this was in the era before seat belts. And so the person driving the car had to slam on brakes, and what happened was that a 3-year-old child in the front seat of this car was thrown against the dashboard and killed. And that's what happened in this life. When Vi saw that reviewed in her life review, she said there was this little filament going to an event that took place in a culture she did not recognize. She did not know where this was. But in this event, what had happened was that Vi was riding on the front seat of a carriage being drawn down the street, and a child that she recognized as the child that had been killed in the automobile accident ran out across the street, and the driver of the carriage pulling back, then in this version, Vi was thrown from the carriage and killed, which is, highly unusual. I mean, that seems to me a detail that wouldn't necessarily need to be balanced, but in this case it was. In 1983, I met in Zurich Stefan van Jonkovic, who was a very well-known architect in Zurich. And Stefan had been a colonel in the unsuccessful Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And he escaped after the revolution collapsed, and he and his family settled in Zurich. And in 1964, Stefan had an automobile wreck in his sports car in the Alps and was believed dead at the scene, but was taken into the hospital and resuscitated, and amazingly, he lived. And Stefan, as he told me, had been raised a Catholic, although he was not religious at that time. But he said that nonetheless, in his life experience, in his near-death experience, he saw several scenes in which he had past lives. And during his long recovery in the hospital, being a graphic artist and designer, he sketched out some of these places he had seen in his past life visions of where he had lived before. And much later, he actually found one of these places, which was a fishing village he had never been to, but nonetheless he had the outlines of the surrounding mountains and everything accurate in his drawings. Incidentally, I should say about Stefan's near-death experience and the life review, there was a very interesting detail in this, and he related one event that had taken place in Hungary before the revolution collapsed. And Stefan apparently lived in an apartment building that was at the top of a hill, and the roadway came to the bottom of the hill and dead-ended. So one day during the revolution, Stefan had gone home to eat lunch. Come to think of it, that's an odd idea, going home during the revolution to eat lunch, I suppose. That's what he did. So he said that when he was having lunch there in his apartment, that he saw a Russian tank come rumbling down the road. And the tank came up to the dead end. And he knew that at some point the soldier would have to lift the lid and look up to see where he was. So Stefan decided, he said, well, I'll shoot him. And so Stefan, showing me the gestures, said that I aimed down over the hatch and just waited, and after a while, sure enough, the hatch came up, and the young Russian soldier poked his head up to look around. And what Stefan told me at this point was, he said, but I just couldn't do it. So he didn't shoot. And he said when this came back to him in his review, he said it was a point in his favor. And that was the word he used. He said it wasn't that if he had killed that person, it was going to be some terrible punishment or whatever, but he said that was, it turned out in his review, that was the correct decision under those circumstances. So all of the cases, incidentally, of these people who, within the context of their near-death experiences, have some indication of pre-existence and reincarnation, have been people from Western traditions, Catholic, Baptist, Jewish, and so on. And by the luck of the draw, I have never, until just about a year or so ago, found a Hindu person who had a near-death experience in which they reported past lives. And this is a very fascinating case, and believe me, you will be hearing more about this. There is a wonderful man, and his name is Dr. Rajiv Parti, P-A-R-T-I. And Rajiv was chief of anesthesiology at the Bakersfield Heart Hospital in California. And according to Raj's picture of his existence up to this point, he was totally consumed by the material world and competitiveness. And he said his whole purpose in life was to have a bigger house and a fancier car than any of his colleagues. And then he had a very dramatic near-death experience in which he saw his entire life reviewed. One interesting thing that came out of this was that Raj said in his life review, he saw quite a number of interactions that he had had with his patients, and that he was very mechanical in his treatment of his patients and not very warm, and would respond to them rather coldly. But he said that in the life review that he had, he would see the backstory of this, and he would see the suffering that was going on with his patients. And this has transformed him, not just as a physician, but also as a person. And I've been with Raj several times when he's lectured, and one time I was sitting on a sort of panel, and Raj was here addressing the audience, and so I could see the reactions of the audience to this man. It's very powerful, and everybody was weeping and so on. He's a very kind-hearted, very sweet person, and to see this kind of transformation in him. But within his near-death experience, he saw very vivid portrayals of his past lives. So, although this is rare statistically, that if you had, say, 1,000 reports of near-death experiences, there would be relatively few, I think, that in which people recall a past life. A lot more people say, not that they saw anything that directly indicated to them that there's reincarnation, but that they had somehow a sense from their time on the other side that they really sort of didn't get far enough into the picture to see reincarnation, but they came back from this experience very much more sympathetic to the idea. The second kind of experience that human experience that relates to past lives and reincarnation are spontaneous past life recollections. And these occur in adults. The way I first became aware of this was in about 86, 87, I guess. I have a good friend who's a travel agent and who sometimes takes tours around Europe, and came to me years ago because she had witnessed something so curious on her recent tour. She had taken a group of American tourists to Europe, and among the people who went was a very rigid American businessman. And when they got into a little town in Italy, this man just fell apart because he had very, very, very vivid memories of having a life in this little town in Italy, whereas he had never really, in this dimension, never gone outside of the United States. So they do happen in adults, and they also happen, I am convinced, in children. This is just a very common thing, and it does not require that the parents have any interest or inclination to this whatsoever. And I know, because mostly in the communities I live, the association network I have does not consist of people with these kinds of interests. But this is something that has fairly regularly, people over the years have brought up to me. They've said, you know, my 3-year-old is talking about some previous existence. So the parents come and you know, are very curious about this. It has happened to me with my own 2 adopted children. Now, Carter, who we adopted at birth from Kerrville, Texas, is Mexican-American by heritage. And Carol Ann, now 14, we adopted at birth from Montana, and she is Blackfeet, Native American. And both of those kids have spontaneously related memories of previous existence. Carter, when he was 5, he and I were up on the bed watching TV, and I was flipping through the channels with the remote control. And I flipped through what turned out to be the National Geographic channel. And when I did, Carter became very, very animated. And he said, Dad, that's my village. And so he went on to explain that when I turned back to the National Geographic channel, as it was a documentary about village life in China. And Carter started this long story of how his mother and father in China and his brothers and sisters. And he could see that I was rather startled. So, as though to orient me, he said, yeah, and then I was up in the trees looking down at you and Mom. And I knew exactly what he was talking about, because 5 years before Carter was conceived, my wife and I were in Greece on a tour. And we were just exhausted from the flight. So at an archaeological site, we were so tired that the attendant could tell, and he said, just go over there and lie down in the grass and take a nap. And there were trees all around. And what we were talking about was adopting a child. Then my little Native American daughter, about, say, 4 years ago, again out of nowhere, we take these long walks. She said one day to me, I don't like this place. And it was plain to me that what she meant was, I don't like this world. So I just said, oh, and she said, yeah. She said, you know, when you die, you just go up and you be with God, and He holds you there till all the people you know while you're alive have died, and then He sends you back as another person. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And she said, just like this, she said, I know in my mind. And she said, and yeah, I was with God, and He pointed you out to me. And He said, you got to go down and be His daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? And she said, oh, I didn't want to do it. She said, I wanted to stay with my Goddie. And I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? And she said, yeah. And incidentally, it's easy, I think, for you to imagine maybe, you know, to say, well, sure, you know, at home He talks about this and so on. But no, actually, Cheryl and I, my wife, we don't talk about life after death. We talk about what's for dinner, you know, the kids' homework, how to pay the phone bill, you know, what's on at the movies. And we don't take these kids to any sort of religious institutions, because we're from Alabama. And I was saying today, we're afraid of snakes. So, you know, they really just don't have any religious training. And interestingly, both of them have found out that I wrote the book Life After Life from the internet. And so, you know, I can be absolutely assured that I didn't put these ideas into these kids' heads. And so it's so consistent with what I've heard from many people over a long period of time, that I am convinced that that this is just a very common experience with kids. And what I surmise happens is that by and large the parents don't want to hear this, so they just sort of get the kid to stop talking about it or say, oh, that's your imagination or whatever. Sometimes these spontaneous past life experiences can have profound effects on people. And I'm sorry to be repeating this for those of you who were this afternoon in the workshop, but it's nonetheless, I mean, I think it's such interesting information. Arnold Toynbee, who wrote a study of history in 11 volumes, when you get to the very end of that book, in volume 11, Toynbee starts talking about why he studied history. And the story is that when he was a young man, 23 years of age, he went on a summer tour to Greece, and I think it was in 1917 or so. And so during that summer trip through Greece, he had several incidents that came on him out of nowhere, in which he says, to use his exact words, he said, I dropped through a pocket in time. And if you read this, you see that Toynbee understood that it was real. Like, he didn't think of it as a fantasy. To him, it was a real event. He said several occasions he just lost track of time in the 20th century and was propelled back to ancient Greece and saw people there. And he said during one of these incidents, he saw this horrific battle with so much, horror, so many horrors, that he said, I decided at that moment to study history to try to understand the role of sin in the affairs of man. Now, Gibbon, who wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, had a similar experience. And I have known a number of history professors over the years, as I have talked about this, who acknowledge that that's how they got interested in history too, was through some sort of spontaneous transmission back to the past, or some kind of spontaneous memory of a previous existence. And then the third kind of experience that people have that relate to the possibility of reincarnation are past life regressions, the hypnotic induction of a trance to regress people back. I first heard about this from a friend, or I first experimented with it myself, through a friend of mine named Diana Denholm, who is a clinical psychologist in Florida. And Diana was using hypnosis not for the purpose of past life regression, but rather for the normal things it's used for, to help people stop smoking and this sort of thing. And she began to use it to try to help people understand their early lives. And she said several times it would happen when she would regress people back to their early childhood, that they wouldn't stop there and they would sort of spontaneously pop back into a previous existence. So that interested her in this, and then she began to do it as part of her practice. And so I got interested in it. I must confess, I am just so crass in so many of my prejudices and so on, as I increasingly realize as I get older. But I remember very specifically the attitude that I had toward the idea of past life regression when I was hearing this. And that was that I assumed, what you hear in the popular press is that everybody is either Napoleon or Cleopatra, right? Or that the people who can do this are very suggestible or histrionic people. But what I quickly learned is that that's just not correct. I've taken maybe 300 or so of my students through the years through this past life regression experience, and all that experience I've never had any of them relate being a famous person, or all of them were just very mundane lives. And so I don't know what to make of this this hypnotic regression. I just don't know. But those are my impressions, is that it's not what the popular view tells you, that it's, you know, people are always somebody famous. It doesn't work that way. One question that the whole notion of reincarnation raises is, what is it that survives? You know, it's like, as I've come to acknowledge or realize, I guess, in the past 3 years or so, I've acknowledged now, to my utter surprise, there is an afterlife. I'm still reeling from that realization. But, therefore, the question becomes even more acute than, what is it that survives? And if you take the classical answers to this in the West, it begins with the notion of the soul. And Plato, for example, had a very elaborate theory of the soul, that the soul is an immaterial entity that inhabits the body. And to Plato, the essence of our personal identity is the soul. The body is secondary and unreal. The soul and the consciousness is the real part to Plato, and the material substance of the body is always changing and in flux or flow, and not intelligible and not real. And so his idea was that the essence of a personal identity is this immaterial thing or entity or substance called the soul. And this was taken up in Western thought, as we all know, through the Middle Ages and so on, into the church. And it was only, say, in the 17th century that real objections and concerns began to be raised about this. And Thomas Hobbes, for example, in the 17th century raised the objection that the idea of an immaterial entity or immaterial substance is self-contradictory and nonsensical. But still the question was, what is it that constitutes our personal identity? And so then 100 years or so elapsed, and then along came John Locke, who thought that the essence of what makes a person the person that person is are our memories. That in effect we are our memories, and that's what makes us up. And this becomes highly dubious when you realize what a flimsy thing memory is, and how it's constantly changing. It's not really as stable as we imagine. And then, in the 18th century, Hume came along and said, well, in his own introspective process, when he looked inside of himself, he could never find any sort of underlying substrate of a self. It was always, the only thing he could catch in action were individual perceptions or ideas or feelings or whatever, and that he couldn't introspect or intuit any underlying self that was the basis of all these things. So that is a sketch, more or less, of how thought about personal identity and what it is that could survive bodily death has gone in the Western intellectual tradition. And so what do I think about it? Well, this realization I had several years ago, or coming to terms with the idea that there does appear to be an afterlife, really set me to thinking about that what is it that constitutes the identity of a person that is passed along or escapes this life to go into some other one. And long about that time, one of my favorite authors is Elie Wiesel, and I hope many of you have had the pleasure of reading. And I was reading one of Ellie's books and came across this statement. He said, God made man because he loves stories. And that hit me as, oh my God, I just had all kinds of thoughts about that, because before I went into forensic psychiatry, I spent some time in geriatric psychiatry and had this wonderful year or so where I had, in addition to my patients with Alzheimer's and Pick's disease and other kinds of dementias, I had plenty of patients who were elderly but who were very cognitively sharp and who were just seeing me because of some situational stress or whatever. And I constantly heard from people, as they would tell me their life stories, I heard the same idea expressed many times. They would say that the older they became, the more the impression developed, the uncanny but undeniable impression developed as they looked back at their life, that it had been a sort of script or a play or a drama. And then when I read that Elie Wiesel said, it just came together. Yes, you know, what is a person really? What is the identity of a human person except that person's life story? I mean, that's about, really, as far as I can tell, that's very close to the essence of a person, is that person's story. And then I also heard that on one of the tapes by Joseph Campbell, related that he had that same experience, that when he got old, he began to look back on his life and developed this irresistible impression that it had been kind of scripted or drafted in a drama. So at least here in January of 2015, that's where I've come to it. I think that the essence of life is story, and that this thing that we're in is a kind of illusionary drama. You think of all of the Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, for example, and one man in his life plays many roles. And I read a statement by a playwright about a year ago who said, a play is just a life with the boring parts taken out. I brought back also a very dramatic experience I had in Charlottesville in 1967. A Broadway musical came through town, and I forgot what one it was, but it was a Broadway musical comedy. And our best friend was the guy who brought the entertainment to UVA, so we got these great seats, and we were on the front row. And in this musical comedy, there was a really terrific comic villain, complete with dark stovepipe hat and the black cape, the whole thing. And at the end of the play, when all the performers came out for their curtain call, when the hero and heroine came out, there were these wild applause, and all the supporting actors and actresses came out, and wild applause. And then the villain came out, and silence. And it was really fascinating, because you could actually feel the waking up of the people, right? That they come like, oh my God, this is just a play, and then they started laughing. I know this sounds rather crazy, but my best estimate at this point in my life is that, as I've heard from a long time ago from my friends here, that the Hindu view that this is a play, kind of a screen of illusions. And I feel that more and more the older I get. You see all of these uncanny things begin to unfold in your life. In one way you might look at this and you say, well, that's just a metaphor. You're taking this one aspect of human life, the theater, and you're projecting that out as an explanation of the whole, and that's a logical fallacy. But I don't think so. I think it happened the other way around. What I think is that, you know, the history of the drama is really one of the most sensational stories of history to me. It's basically, there was this ruler of Athens named Pisistratus, and in Athens there had been this traditional festival of singing and chanting and so on, and it was a harvest festival, I think. And there were stories that came out through these choruses that would sing these things. And one person, Thespis, stepped forward at one of these things and became, in fact, the first actor to speak his separate lines. And this so impressed Pisistratus that he set up a competition. And you know, the Greeks had this incredible streak of competitiveness. You know, imagine these very complex societies, really, who are constantly at war with the other city 20 miles down the road. I mean, that's pretty crazy. So competition was throughout that culture. So he set up a competition to see to see who could come up with the best of these new kind of instruments, what we call plays. And Aeschylus came along, and his innovation was that he had two characters speaking. Then came Sophocles, and his innovation was he got it up to 3. And then with Euripides, we have a whole cast of people. And that was the history of drama. And 50 years after they started this competition, acting and being in the theater was already a profession. Initially, the theaters were temples to the gods or goddesses, and these plays were enacted within them. But what I think probably happened is that people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, being very brilliant observers of human natures, you can tell from those plays, that they had picked up on this aspect of life, that when you get old, you look back and you see this dramatic structure to it, a beginning and a middle and an end and all the twists and so on. And so that they just decided, hey, we can create a space here where we can condense this and put it on for people's amusement. You know what the most perplexing thing to the historians who study the history of the theater, the wildest and most difficult thing for them to figure out is how in the world these guys got people to sit still for so long to watch something. If you think about it, that was totally unprecedented. They had the games, of course, but then people were jumping around and yelling and screaming. But how, they want to know, did these guys get people to sit down for a length of time like that and to watch something without moving around? It's a very great mystery. One other little point I want to raise. Every time I read the Republic, every 4 years or so, I see details in it and I think, how in the world did I miss that? And this last time, about a year ago, I read the Republic, I saw something that I'm still reeling from this, because the Republic ends in this story of the Armenian warrior, who had a near-death experience. And is describing what he saw on the other side. And near the last of his narrative, he's describing what he saw about the people who were lining up to get into this world. And he said the last thing that happened was that they would go down to this place, and you can see it for yourself and read it for yourself and see what you think and see maybe I'm imagining things, right? I might well be. But it looks to me that what Plato was trying to describe is some sort of screen, almost like a computer screen, because they're looking down. These people are getting ready to go over to this world, and they're looking down, and there's a guide there who shows them on this flat surface are depicted all the different kinds of patterns of lives that this person could choose to go into. And some of them are criminals, and some of them are holy people, the whole gamut. But the last thing that this guide says to them is, whatever life you choose, it won't affect the quality of your soul. Now, what did he mean by that? I don't know. It's, I think it would go along very well with the idea of a drama. You know, that this life we're living in is a sort of, it's a stage show, in a way, that we're going through, hopefully, to learn things and experience things. What I'm really faced with now is, with this knowledge and understanding, what's the best way to behave in this world? When I was talking about this with some of the students earlier today, somebody said, well, gosh, you know, why wouldn't you just have license to go and do terrible things? Well, number one, doing terrible things feels bad. And also, we know that in our life review, you know, whatever we put out there, we're going to have to get back, right? Because the actions you put out to others in the final phase of your life, in your life review, you review those identical same actions, but from the perspective of the people with whom you've interacted. So, this is still a big mystery to me, and I'm so grateful to all my friends here and my long association with them, as we're all trying together, I think, to understand more about this rather incomprehensible world that we're living in. And I want to say again to all of you, thank you so much for this. It's just been delightful to be with you, and I hope I'll get to see you all again. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock at my workshop, I'm going to talk about grief. And in that connection, we will talk about also other kinds of spiritual experiences related to death and dying. But the reason I want to talk about grief is that this is almost always a factor in what brings people to a concern with the question of an afterlife. Is very often that they lose a loved one to death, and then they turn to this afterlife question with a very great urgency. And grief itself is an inherently fascinating process. It's I think grief is one of the big mysteries of the mind. So we will talk about that tomorrow. And again, thank you all so much for this wonderful opportunity.